Doug Fairbanks, Part 2. As I mentioned earlier, Doug was number 8 at the box office in 1916 and moved into 1917 at number 1. One of his biggest hits that year is one of my favorite Fairbanks films, Wild and Woolly, which co-starred Eileen Percy. Doug played Jeff Henlington this time, a rich heir to a railroad tycoon who is bored in the East and wants to live in the Wild Wild West. He even has his bedroom made up to look like a Western location, as you'll see in just a second. Upon re-examination, Jeff reminds me of Dudley Moore's character in Arthur, and especially Mickey Rooney's character in Girl Crazy. Jeff's father ends up sending him out west, probably just to get rid of him, where he has to rise to the occasion to foil a villain's plan to save the day, getting the girl in the process. Take a look at both of these clips that take place in the Eastern setting. The sheer energy that Doug brings to Jeff is astonishing. Also, keep in mind that Doug was already 34 here, but appears convincingly a much more youthful man. He throws his entire self into the part, which I will point out he did for every part. In my opinion, the amount of just everything that Doug brings here has probably never been matched by another actor. I know I've said that before, and I'll say it again. I also want to point out that the film includes the athleticism that Doug would become so famous for in the 1920s. Naturally, it was a huge smash hit, keeping him at number 1 at the box office, and critics loved it too. Exhibitors Herald wrote, "This is a real Fairbanks picture, and every foot of it radiates with his magnetic personality." Another Doug film of note that year was A Modern Musketeer, also a huge hit. As the title suggests, it was inspired by The Three Musketeers, the Dumas adventure novel that itself became a huge hit a few years later for Doug. But in 1917, A Modern Musketeer saw his very first swashbuckling adventure, a type of role that would come to define him in about 3 years. In the film, Doug played D'Artagnan, Dumas' hero of the novel, who after engaging in a sword fight wakes up in 1917 and is actually just a Three Musketeers fan named Ned Thacker. The rest of the film was pretty standard Fairbanks comedic western, where he fights, wins, and gets the girl, but this time contained that D'Artagnan twist, who Ned ends up trying to emulate. Take a look at this clip. Here we have probably the first shot of Doug sword fighting, an action that would come to define him and the characters he would play later on. Doug is that cocky, mischievous, and courageous hero that has to use a sword to prove his point. In the second clip, whereas Ned, Doug gets to demonstrate his athletic abilities, which also, if you watch this on YouTube, someone has amazingly put the theme from Zorro as a piano solo, Zelda, the Nintendo game, as a piano solo to accompany the scene, and it's wonderful. But I digress. There's also an agility to his movements that is dance-like. His movements are so precise and so carefully timed that they seem effortless, although it was clear a significant amount of physical exertion went into them. The film was another critical and commercial hit. 1918 saw Doug make yet another new type of comedic film, this time a social comedy called Mr. Fix-It. It saw Doug as Dick Remington, a social fix-it man, if you will, who goes into homes to repair damaged relationships among families. This time, he goes into the wealthy Burroughs family home to make peace and falls in love with a wealthy young lady who is visiting along the way. Take a look at this clip. Dick is trying in vain to melt the icy, snooty heart of Marjorie Threadwell, played by Marjorie Dahl. Notice that he is much more reserved in his acting style here, and his expressions are much more subtle to suggest that he is among people of class. I cannot find the critical or commercial reviews for the film, but since it was released when Doug was number 1 at the box office, I can only assume that it was a well-praised hit as well. I also want to mention really quickly that Doug was the writer and the producer for most, if not all, of his films from 1917 through 1933. You heard me mention earlier his glowing reviews for his writing, but it's also clear that he also had a knack for producing the perfect vehicles to showcase his acting talent. He also was well aware of what the public was asking for and was able to tailor-make his pictures to ensure success and audience satisfaction. In 1919, Doug produced and wrote, and obviously starred in, When the Clouds Roll By, a comedy that saw him playing Daniel Boone Brown, a superstitious young man that becomes the victim of experiments put onto him by a mad scientist. The film was the usual style of Fairbanks comedy, with him overcoming the odds, saving the day, and getting the girl at the end, this time played by Kathleen Clifford. What made When the Clouds Rolled By stand out was its amazing special effects for the time period, which allowed also Doug to demonstrate some of his amazing athletic abilities that would come to define his career very, very soon. In this very impressive dream sequence, Doug walks up the walls and crosses the ceiling. While he's obviously not really doing that, I assume, his dance-like movements are back, and his physicality makes it all the more believable that he is really walking up the wall and across the ceiling, years before Fred Astaire would do it in Royal Wedding. The film was another critical and commercial hit. Exhibitors Herald wrote, Fairbanks has made nothing so good as When the Clouds Roll By since his picture in the paper, another film. Even that classic that was considered by many his best work might not compare favorably with the present production. This picture has an enriched measure of the qualities that citizens expect when they lay their money upon the box office windowsill of the theater exhibiting a Fairbanks photoplay. In 1920, Doug made a film that would serve as a turning point in his career. A shift from comedies to a type of film that would, I've said this probably 15 times already, but would come to define his lasting legacy as a movie star, the swashbuckling hero. While he had briefly visited the persona in A Modern Musketeer, it was 1920's The Mark of Zorro that really cemented the idea and shifted Doug's career into this new direction. Speaking of new directions, in 1919, Doug, his soon-to-be second wife, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith founded United Artists, a new production agency that would production company that would allow actors to control their own interests and not have to give into studio demands. Thus, Doug was producing and distributing his own films from his own production company from now on. Doug based his Zorro story on Johnston Macaulay's 1919 story, The Curse of Capistrano. In the film, Doug played Don Diego Vega, who appears to be just the son of wealth, but who secretly disguises himself as Zorro, a Robin Hood-like hero that seeks to correct the injustices that the poor are experiencing from the wealthy. Zorro pounces on the wealthy wrongdoers and leaves his notorious Z symbol on their faces. To me, and probably lots of you watching this, the Zorro character will forever be associated with the 1950s and 60s TV series that starred Guy Williams and was rerun constantly over the years, at least in the 1990s when I was watching it. But Doug's version was the first. Zorro gave Doug the chance to fully display all of his considerable athletic abilities. Horseback riding, sword fighting, leaping, jumping, running, but it also allowed Doug to play a character of real honor. Take this scene, for example. Zorro demands that Captain Ramon, played by Robert McKim, apologize to Lolita, played by Marguerite Delamotte, who would co-star with Doug in several films. Zorro even allows Ramon to have his sword back in the event that they do fight again, as it was unsportsmanlike to leave your opponent unarmed. While Zorro got mixed reviews from the critics, including the New York Times, the audiences loved it and it was a huge smash hit. Doug's popularity at the box office had lowered to number 4, but after Zorro, he was back up to number 2 by 1921, second only to his wife, Mary Pickford. 1921 also saw Doug make his last real silent comedy film, The Nut, before he moved on to solely focus on making adventure films for the remainder of the decade. The Nut saw Doug playing Charlie Jackson, a wacky inventor in love with Estrelle, played by Marguerite Delamotte. She has an idea that poor children can benefit from spending time in wealthy houses, kind of like Annie, and Charlie tries to help her with this idea. Lots of comedic situations ensue, including this one where Charlie must creatively create some clothes from an advertisement after his clothes catch fire and fall off at the disastrous party that he throws for Estrelle's cause. Doug still displays a perfect niche that he has found for comedy, combined with athleticism and physicality. Had The Nut been released 2 years earlier, it probably would have been a massive hit. But Doug had just had such a hit with Zorro that the public and critics alike wanted to see more adventure films involving him saving the day with daring stunts versus a wacky comedy involving a kooky inventor. It was still a mild hit though, and Doug was still mildly praised, just nowhere near the level that he was used to. Exhibitors Herald wrote, "Fairbanks gets some laughs, but not enough to dole out the quota expected of them." Motion Picture News said, "It was a fine picture that brought good business, but also it was not up to the star's standards and much poorer than Zorro." The Nut was a gamble on whether Doug could go back and forth between character types. While it made money and wasn't bombed, it seemed old-fashioned and beneath the sheer excitement that he displayed in Zorro. Doug took the memo and focused solely on his adventure films for the remainder of the silent era. His next film fit the formula and became a massive, massive hit. The Three Musketeers of 1921. Stay with me for, Doug Fairbanks Part 3, where we will begin with The Three Musketeers. Thank you.